Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about 6 narrative plot lines for personal narratives. So these are story structures or ways of building the movement of stories, ways of dealing with how we move through narrative structures. So I'm going to show you this lovely PowerPoint that's going to take us through 6 narrative arcs for personal narratives. Personal narratives are a very common genre. It's worth prefacing this. Personal narratives are a very common genre in like first-year writing classes and things like this, as well as creative writing classes where you're doing creative nonfiction. So these are 6 storylines, 6 approaches to telling stories that lend themselves particularly well to personal narratives or personal essays. So I've broken them up into 3 groups of 2. The first are what I would call the Tolstoy or Gardner plots, because there's a famous story that Leo Tolstoy, famous Russian novelist and philosopher, argued that there are only 2 plots in all of literature. The documentary evidence that I've seen suggests that Tolstoy probably didn't say this. The novelist John Gardner probably said this originally. But the 2 plots are the hero goes on a journey and a stranger comes to town. So we're going to start with those 2. So the hero goes on a journey. This is one of the Tolstoy Gardner plot lines. And basically in this story, a protagonist, so that's the main character, the person whose story we are interested in, leaves home or a space of comfort, and I'm going to use the term home sort of broadly here. This may be the literal house/home, or this may be nation, this may be neighborhood, community, whatever it is. But they are leaving a space that they are comfortable and familiar with, venturing out, usually on some sort of quest that is to achieve a particular objective. And during that time, they encounter obstacles to be overcome. Typically, at the end of the hero goes on a journey narrative, they return richer for the experience, whether that's having gained wisdom, having gained material benefits, they've gotten something out of this journey. It has overall improved them in some way. And there's a bunch of other elements to the hero goes on a journey story that you typically have. Things like having a mentor, things like having allies, things like this. These are quest narratives, essentially, right? You are dealing with a protagonist who has some sort of goal. And they have to go out of their comfort zone to try and achieve that goal. Things like The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, Beowulf. These kinds of things are really good examples of the hero goes on a journey, or at least the first portion of Beowulf, where he goes out to face Grendel. So that's one of these plot lines, the Tolstoy Gardner plot lines. The other is, to move this up a little bit, the stranger comes to town. And in this plot line, the protagonist remains at home or in a space where they are comfortable, but an outside entity arrives, making home no longer comfortable. So the space itself that had been hospitable and familiar becomes defamiliarized. It becomes uncomfortable in some way. And then the protagonist has to adapt to this new situation. They have to figure out what to do with this space that is no longer home, no longer safe. So these are stories in which there's some sort of disturbing force. This may be an individual. There's maybe a person who shows up to change things in home and precipitate this conflict, or this may be some sort of entity, say a disease, in something like, for instance, Albert Camus' The Plague. a novel that for many of us has recently taken on much more significance in the COVID and post-COVID periods. But this can also be something like a new idea that arrives that challenges the way a character thinks about the world around them. So these are the first two. The second two are what I call finding one's way plots. So these are about exploring experience, basically. And the first one is the Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story. Bildungsroman is basically just a fancy literary way of saying coming of age. And so in this storyline, a protagonist begins at a state of immaturity or a stage of immaturity. Now, this can be literal immaturity, this can be a child, or this can be emotional immaturity, psychological immaturity. Somebody who maybe is chronologically an adult, but still behaves like a child, or someone who is in some way naive, somebody who is unprepared to sort of reconcile and deal with the challenges of the adult world. But through a series of experiences and revelations, they move toward maturity. So things happen to them, often challenges, obstacles, issues that they have to face that lead them to know things about themselves they did not know before. And this knowledge moves them toward maturity. Again, whether that's adulthood as such, or whether that's sort of psychological adulthood, something like this. The other finding one's way plot is overcoming adversity. And this can be quite similar. In this instance, the protagonist deals with a series of problems or a series of challenges that test them in some way. Whether this is their moral fortitude, whether this is their courage, whether this is whatever it is. And generally, through overcoming this series of obstacles, the protagonist once again ends up richer for the experience. Kind of the difference between a Bildungsroman or coming-of-age story and an overcoming adversity story is that the coming-of-age story implies growth from immaturity to maturity. So there's a distinct movement the character goes through, whereas overcoming adversity may or may not have that kind of movement, that kind of arc. The character definitely goes through trials and gains something for the experience of going through those trials, but that may not be maturity. That may be something else. So that's the real distinction there. The next set of plot lines are what I call the negative experience plot lines. So the first one is a fish out of water story. And this is a bit tenuous, whether this is really negative experience or not. It depends on how the protagonist moves through the story and what the story is doing. But it is basically a challenging experience. So that's why I put it in this category. But basically, the protagonist is taken from home. So again, whatever that is, that space of familiarity, of comfort, and they're placed into an unfamiliar or uncomfortable space, somewhere they don't feel like they belong. Maybe they don't know how to navigate that space. They don't know the cultural norms. They don't know the proper ways to behave. They feel out of place. And in the course of that plot line, they need to learn to navigate that new space, to exist in that unfamiliar space, and to become comfortable. And that's where it can sort of shift out of the negative experience plot as such. Because if it is ultimately a positive experience that leads to growth through that adversity, then it's related to the overcoming adversity plot. But the fish out of water element, the negative experience of that discomfort, of that feeling unfamiliar, is why I put this in the negative experiences plot. The other one is a bit more directly negative experience, and that's the story of loss. So in this narrative arc, the protagonist loses someone or something important to them and must learn to cope with that loss. Often this is a person. So this may be a family member, this may be a significant other, but often it's a person, but not always. Sometimes this may be losing a portion of one's identity, say losing one's religious faith, losing one's connection to nation, or this might be losing a physical object, um, losing, say, a security blanket in a children's story, maybe, or family heirloom, an important signed baseball in the movie The Sandlot, for instance. But it's a story of a protagonist who in some way loses something important and has to figure out, what do I do now? How do I live without having that thing that was important to my life? So those are the six basic plot lines I would suggest make a lot of sense for a personal narrative. And I want to show you something kind of interesting. Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, one of the most important films of all time. I think most people would accept that claim. This kind of represents all six of these narrative arcs. So this one film incorporates all of these components. So if we look back at the list of the six plot lines I've given us, the hero goes on a journey, the stranger comes to town, coming of age, overcoming adversity, fish out of water, and story of loss. A New Hope has them all, right? The hero goes on a journey. This is really kind of the central one, as Luke Skywalker leaves the farm, the moisture farm on Tatooine, to go out and fight the Empire and destroy the Death Star. That is his journey. We have the stranger comes to town storyline, and there's a couple of ways in which this can work. R2-D2 is probably one of the most prominent elements of the stranger comes to town narrative here, because R2-D2 arrives with the message from Princess Leia that sets the whole action in motion. Luke goes out to seek Ben Kenobi in the desert because of this message. So the stranger who has come to town, R2-D2, gives Luke new information that leads him to leave the space in which he was comfortable. The space of home becomes unfamiliar. We can also point out that the stormtroopers show up and kill Luke's aunt and uncle, thereby making home even more unfamiliar. Literally defamiliarizing it in the sense of removing family from it, since family and familiar have the same etymological root. We have the coming of age story. Luke is in some ways the obvious coming of age example, because he goes from this overconfident kid at the beginning of the film to sort of recognizing how much more work he needs to do, how much he needs to grow and develop to become the person he wants to be. But also we've got the Han Solo storyline, right? Because Han Solo starts out very much self-centered, very much self-serving, not concerned about others. And then at the end of the film, he shows back up with the Millennium Falcon to take out Vader in his TIE fighter so that Luke can destroy the Death Star. So he moves from this space of emotional immaturity and selfishness to this more mature space of recognizing the needs and the value of others. The overcoming adversity storyline. They have to blow up a weapon the size of a moon that can destroy planets. They've also got to contend with Darth Vader and his command of the Force. And of course, the ability to destroy a planet is insignificant when compared with the power of the Force, which Darth Vader controls better than almost anybody else in the original 3 movies, probably with the exception of Yoda. So we've got that element. We've got both adversity in terms of the technical machinery that they are facing, but also an adversary who's incredibly powerful. The fish out of water story. Luke grows up on a moisture farm. He is very sheltered, very rural, very, has not been exposed to the universe. And then he goes out and he's meeting all these bizarre creatures, and he's on spaceships and things like this. But I think we get the most sort of immediate depiction of him in as a fish out of water in the Mos Eisley Cantina, right? Because he gets into a fight because he doesn't know how to interact with these other denizens of this cantina. So he is unfamiliar, uncomfortable with this space. And then we've got the story of loss. And again, there's a couple of different elements of A New Hope that deals with this story of loss. But maybe the most prominent is when Vader strikes down Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Obi-Wan Kenobi becomes more powerful than Vader could possibly imagine. The next thing that we see, basically, after they make their escape, after Luke, Leia, and Han, and the droids, and Chewbacca make their escape, basically the next thing we see is Luke mourning the loss of his mentor. And it's only an external force that sort of jogs him out of that depression. So the point here is not necessarily that A New Hope is a great movie, although it is, and if you haven't seen it, you should, because it's an important part of our intangible cultural heritage. But the point here is that A New Hope is a really good example of how a narrative can take multiple storylines, multiple narrative arcs, and blend them together to make an even stronger storyline. Yes, we can have stories that are just coming-of-age stories, or just stories of loss, just a stranger comes to town, whatever it is. But often you will find that successful storytelling blends multiple components from this.